The rain taps against my window like fingers drumming on wood, and I'm sitting here in my apartment, staring at the door that changed everything 3 months ago. It's just a door painted white with a brass handle that needs polishing, but every time I look at it, I remember the sound of his knuckles against the wood at 2 in the morning, desperate and unsteady. I remember opening it to find Henry Walker standing there, soaked through and swaying slightly, his dark hair plastered to his forehead and his eyes holding something I'd never seen before. Something that looked dangerously close to the truth we'd been dancing around for 6 years. The coffee in my hands has gone cold, but I keep holding the mug because it gives me something to do with my fingers. Outside, the city moves through its evening routine, people hurrying home from work, couples sharing umbrellas, life continuing in all its ordinary ways while I sit here replaying that night over and over. If you're watching this from somewhere out there in the world, drop a comment and let me know where you are right now. And if this story moves you at all, hit that hype button to help others find it too. Sometimes we all need to know we're not alone in these complicated feelings. Henry had been drinking. That much was obvious from the way he leaned against my doorframe, like it was the only thing keeping him upright. But it wasn't just the alcohol that made him seem different that night. There was something raw in his expression, something stripped bare that I'd only caught glimpses of in all the years I'd known him. We'd been friends since college, the kind of friendship that everyone assumed would naturally evolve into something more, but somehow never did. At least not in any way we acknowledged out loud. I think about the first time I saw him, freshman year in Professor Martinez's American Literature class. He sat 3 rows ahead of me, and I spent more time watching the way his pen moved across his notebook than I did listening to lectures about Hemingway and Fitzgerald. There was something about the careful way he formed his letters, the occasional pause when he tapped the pen against his lips while thinking, that drew my attention in ways I wasn't ready to understand yet. When he turned around that first day to ask if he could borrow a pen, I felt something shift inside my chest, a recognition that scared me enough to spend the next several weeks avoiding eye contact. But Henry Walker wasn't the kind of person you could avoid for long, not when you shared 3 classes and lived in the same dorm. He had this way of drawing people in without seeming to try, a quiet confidence that made others want to be near him. He was studying English with a focus on creative writing, and sometimes I'd catch him scribbling in a small notebook during our breaks, his brow furrowed in concentration. I wanted to ask what he was writing, but there was something private about those moments that felt too intimate to interrupt. We became friends the way most college friendships form, through proximity and shared experiences. Late nights in the library during finals, grabbing coffee between classes, complaining about Professor Chen's impossible calculus assignments that we both struggled through. Henry had a way of making even the most mundane moments feel significant, like when he'd save me a seat in the dining hall or remember that I took my coffee with too much sugar and not enough cream. Looking back now, I can see the signs that I was blind to then, or maybe just unwilling to see. The way his gaze would linger on me when he thought I wasn't looking. How he'd find excuses to touch my shoulder or brush against my hand when we walked together. There were moments when the air between us felt charged with something unspoken, conversations that seemed to carry more weight than their words suggested. But I was 20 years old and terrified of what those moments might mean. So I learned to deflect them, to turn serious conversations towards safer ground. Junior year, Henry started dating Sarah Jimenez, a psychology major with kind eyes and a laugh that could fill a room. I told myself I was happy for him, that the strange hollow feeling in my stomach when I saw them together was just normal adjustment to sharing my best friend's attention. Sarah was genuinely lovely, the kind of person who remembered your birthday and asked about your family and made everyone feel welcome in her presence. She fit into Henry's life seamlessly, and I watched from the sidelines as they built something that looked easy and natural and right. But there were cracks, tiny fissures that only someone who knew Henry as well as I did would notice. The way he'd go quiet sometimes when Sarah was talking, his attention drifting to something beyond her shoulder. How he'd suggest we all hang out as a group more often than most couples would want to include a third wheel. The night he showed up at my dorm room after a fight with Sarah, not wanting to talk about it but just needing to sit in my space for a while, both of us pretending to study while the tension hummed between us like a live wire. They broke up the spring of senior year, And Henry never really explained why. Just said they wanted different things, that they'd grown apart, the usual explanations that don't really explain anything. I remember the night he told me how we sat on the steps outside the library sharing a bottle of cheap wine he'd smuggled out of his room, and how the space between us felt different somehow, more dangerous, more possible. That was the night I almost said something, almost reached across the small distance between us and touched his face, almost asked him what we were really doing here. But then a group of students walked by, laughing loudly about something, and the moment broke like a soap bubble, leaving us both staring at our hands and talking about graduation plans instead. After college, we stayed in touch the way good friends do, even as geography and careers pulled us in different directions. Henry moved to Seattle for a job at a small literary magazine, and I stayed in Portland, working at a marketing firm and trying to convince myself that the ache I felt whenever I thought about him was just nostalgia. We'd text regularly, call each other on birthdays, meet up whenever he was in town visiting his parents. But there was always this careful distance between us now, like we both understood that we'd stepped too close to something in college and needed to maintain safer boundaries. He dated other people, and so did I, though my relationships never seemed to stick the way they should have. There was always something missing, some essential connection that I couldn't quite name but could feel the absence of. My friends would ask why I was so picky, why I couldn't just settle down with someone nice, and I'd make jokes about being married to my career or not having found the right person yet. But the truth was simpler and more complicated than that. The truth was that I'd already found the right person, and he was living 6 hours away, building a life that didn't include me in the way I wanted it to. 3 years after graduation, Henry moved back to Portland. He'd gotten a job at a larger publication, and he said he missed the city, missed being close to his family, missed having real seasons instead of Seattle's endless gray. But when he called to tell me he was moving back, there was something in his voice that made me think maybe he missed more than just the rain in the mountains. Maybe he missed me too. We fell back into friendship easily, the way you do with people who really know you. Coffee dates that stretched into dinner, long walks through the neighborhoods we'd explored as college students, conversations that picked up threads from years ago as if no time had passed at all. But underneath the comfortable familiarity, I could feel something shifting, some tectonic movement in the foundation of what we were to each other. Henry had changed in subtle ways during his time in Seattle. He was more confident, more settled in himself, but there was also a restlessness in him that hadn't been there before. He'd grown his hair out a little longer, and he had this habit now of running his fingers through it when he was thinking, which happened more often than it used to. He'd started wearing different clothes too, softer sweaters and better-fitting jeans, like he'd finally figured out how to dress the body he'd been living in for 25 years. We started spending more time together, probably more time than was strictly appropriate for two single friends who'd never quite defined what they were to each other. Weekend mornings at the farmer's market, evening movies at the small theater downtown, dinners at restaurants that felt too intimate for friendship, but not quite intimate enough for anything else. Told myself we were just catching up, making up for lost time, but I knew it was more than that. I could feel it in the way Henry looked at me sometimes, like he was trying to solve a puzzle he'd been working on for years. The first time I really understood that something had changed was a Thursday night in October. We'd gone to see a band at a small venue in southeast Portland, one of those hole-in-the-wall places with sticky floors and excellent acoustics. The music was good, indie folk with lyrics that cut straight to the heart, and somewhere during the second set, I looked over to find Henry watching me instead of the stage. When our eyes met, he didn't look away like he usually did. Instead, he held my gaze for a long moment, and I felt something pass between us that was impossible to misinterpret. After the show, we walked to his car in silence, the October air sharp with the promise of winter. Henry fumbled with his keys for longer than necessary, and when he finally unlocked the doors, he paused with his hand on the handle. "Scott," he said, and my name sounded different in his voice somehow, weighted with something I couldn't identify. "Yeah?" He opened his mouth like he was about to say something important, then seemed to think better of it. "Nothing, just thanks for coming with me tonight." I wanted to push, wanted to ask what he'd really been about to say, but I was too afraid of the answer. So I just nodded and got in the car, and we drove home through the empty streets with the radio playing softly between us, both of us pretending that nothing had almost happened. But things did change after that night, in small ways that added up to something significant. Henry started texting me more often, random thoughts and observations throughout the day, like he wanted to share his life with me in real time. He'd send me pictures of interesting things he saw, articles he thought I'd like, songs that reminded him of conversations we'd had. It felt like courtship, though neither of us would have called it that. We started having dinner together twice a week, then 3 times, then most nights when we weren't otherwise occupied. Henry was a better cook than I was, and he'd invite me over to try new recipes he'd found online. I'd bring wine or dessert, and we'd eat at his small kitchen table while talking about work, about books we were reading, about everything except the thing that was growing between us, like a plant reaching towards sunlight. Those dinners became the best part of my week, something I looked forward to with an anticipation that felt dangerous in its intensity. There was something deeply domestic about them, something that felt like playing house in the most wonderful and terrifying way. Henry would light candles sometimes, claiming it was just for ambiance, but I could see the way he watched my face in the flickering light, like he was memorizing something he might lose. One evening in November, I was helping him clean up after dinner when our hands collided reaching for the same dish. It was such a small thing, the kind of accidental contact that happens between friends all the time, but neither of us pulled away immediately. For a moment, we stood there with our fingers overlapping, looking down at our joined hands like they belonged to other people. I could feel Henry's pulse through his fingertips, quick and unsteady, matching my own. "Scott," he said again, that same weighted way he'd said my name outside the venue. This time I looked up, met his eyes directly, and saw my own want reflected back at me. We were standing close enough that I could see the small scar on his chin from a childhood accident, close enough that I could smell his cologne mixed with the scent of the dinner we'd just shared, close enough to kiss him if I'd been brave enough to close the distance. But I wasn't brave enough. Not yet. Instead, I stepped back, breaking the contact, and made some joke about being clumsy. Henry laughed, but it sounded forced, and the rest of the evening felt strained in a way that left us both exhausted by the time I went home. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it a series of storms that left the city gray and sodden. Henry and I continued our routine of dinners and movies and long conversations. But there was a new tension between us now, an awareness of what we weren't saying that made every interaction feel like walking on ice. I caught him looking at me more often, and I'm sure he caught me doing the same. We were like two people circling each other in an elaborate dance, getting closer and closer to something we couldn't name. The holidays were difficult in ways I hadn't anticipated. Henry's family invited me to their Christmas dinner, as they had for the past several years, but this time felt different. His mother, Lauren Jackson, kept making comments about how nice it was to see Henry so happy, how good we were for each other, how we should really think about settling down soon. She clearly thought we were a couple, or should be, and neither Henry nor I corrected her assumptions. We just exchanged glances across the dinner table and tried to ignore the way his father nodded approvingly whenever we interacted. New Year's Eve was worse. We'd planned to go to a party thrown by mutual friends, but at the last minute, Henry suggested we stay in instead. He said he wasn't in the mood for crowds, that he'd rather just hang out at his place and watch the ball drop on television. It sounded perfect to me, intimate and low-key, exactly the kind of evening I'd been craving. But as midnight approached, I realized the trap we'd set for ourselves. There we were, alone together on the most romantic night of the year, and the question of what would happen when the clock struck 12 hung between us like a challenge. Would we kiss? Would we pretend it was just a friendly celebration? Would we finally acknowledge what had been building between us for months? As it turned out, we did none of those things. When the countdown began, Henry suddenly remembered that he needed to call his sister, who was spending New Year's in New York. He disappeared into his bedroom for the entire countdown, leaving me alone on his couch to watch strangers kiss on television, while I wondered what I was doing with my life. He came back 20 minutes later with apologies about family obligations and bad cell service, but we both knew what had really happened. He'd run away from the moment just like I would have if I'd thought of it first. We were both cowards, too afraid of ruining what we had to risk reaching for what we wanted. January and February passed in a haze of careful normalcy. We maintained our routines, but the easy comfort we'd built over the months felt strained now, like a sweater that had been stretched too far and couldn't quite return to its original shape. I started dating someone from work, a nice guy named Christopher Powell, who was everything Henry wasn't. Straightforward, uncomplicated, emotionally available in ways that felt both refreshing and somehow insufficient. Henry was supportive of my relationship with Christopher in the way good friends should be, asking polite questions and offering encouraging words. But I could see something dim in his eyes whenever Christopher's name came up. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was projecting my own complicated feelings onto him, but I couldn't shake the sense that I was hurting him somehow just by trying to move on. Christopher and I dated for 3 months, and it was fine. Better than fine, really. He was kind and funny and genuinely interested in building something real with me. But every time we kissed, every time he held my hand or told me he was falling for me, I felt like I was betraying someone. Not Christopher, who deserved better than a boyfriend who was emotionally unavailable. Not myself, though I was certainly doing that too. I was betraying Henry, even though he'd never asked for my loyalty, even though we'd never promised each other anything more than friendship. The relationship with Christopher ended the way most of my relationships ended, with me pulling away gradually until he had no choice but to let me go. He was gracious about it, more gracious than I deserved, and I felt terrible for wasting his time and emotional energy on something I'd known from the beginning couldn't work. Henry didn't ask many questions when I told him Christopher and I had broken up, just offered the kind of general sympathy that friends provide during romantic disappointments. But I caught him looking relieved when he thought I wasn't paying attention, and that small moment of satisfaction in his expression told me everything I needed to know about how he really felt. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it brought with it a restless energy that affected both of us. Henry seemed more agitated than usual, more prone to long silences and sudden changes of subject. He'd started running in the mornings, something he'd never done before, and when I asked him about it, he said he needed to burn off excess energy. I wondered what kind of energy he was trying to exhaust, but I didn't ask. Our dinner routine continued, but the conversations felt different now, more charged with things we weren't saying. Henry would start to tell me something, then stop mid-sentence and shake his head, claiming he'd forgotten what he was going to say. I'd catch him staring at me sometimes with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between longing and frustration and fear. One evening in April, we were walking through Laurelhurst Park after dinner when Henry suddenly stopped in the middle of the path. I turned back to find him standing completely still, his hands clenched at his sides, looking like he was fighting some internal battle. "What's wrong?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "I can't do this anymore," he said, and my heart stopped for a moment before I realized he wasn't talking about our friendship. He was talking about something else, something bigger and more frightening. "Can't do what?" He looked at me then with an expression so raw and vulnerable that I had to fight the urge to look away. "Pretend," he said simply. "I can't pretend anymore that this is just friendship, that I don't think about you every morning when I wake up and every night before I fall asleep. I can't pretend that I didn't move back to Portland because I missed you more than I missed anything else in my life. I can't pretend that watching you date other people doesn't make me want to punch walls and scream and do all sorts of things that aren't very mature or rational." The words hung between us in the evening air, and I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. This was it, the moment I'd been both dreading and hoping for since that night in college when we'd almost crossed a line we couldn't uncross. Henry was laying his cards on the table, offering me everything I'd wanted and been too afraid to ask for. And I panicked. "Henry," I started, but he held up a hand to stop me. "You don't have to say anything right now," he said. "I just needed you to know. I needed to stop carrying this around by myself. But I did have to say something, because silence felt like a kind of answer, and it wasn't the answer either of us deserved." The problem was that I didn't know what the right answer was. I wanted him, had wanted him for years, But wanting someone and being ready to build a life with them are two different things. I was terrified of ruining our friendship, terrified of not being enough for him, terrified of all the ways love could go wrong and leave us both broken. I need some time to think, I said finally, and I watched something crumble in his expression. Of course, he said, but his voice had gone flat and distant. Take all the time you need. We walked back to his car in silence, and the drive to my apartment felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life. When he dropped me off, Henry didn't get out to walk me to my door like he usually did. He just waited until I was safely inside, then drove away into the night, leaving me standing at my window, watching his taillights disappear. I didn't sleep that night, or the next, or the one after that. I kept replaying Henry's words, the look on his face when he'd said them, the way my own fear had made me retreat just when I should have been brave enough to step forward. I thought about all the years we'd wasted dancing around each other, all the opportunities we'd let slip away because we were too afraid to risk everything for the possibility of something real. But I also thought about all the ways it could go wrong. What if we tried and failed? What if the reality of being together didn't live up to the fantasy we'd built in our heads? What if I wasn't capable of loving him the way he deserved to be loved? I'd never been in a serious relationship with a man, had barely admitted to myself that I was attracted to men at all. Henry would be taking a chance on someone who didn't even fully understand his own heart yet. A week passed without contact between us, the longest we'd gone without speaking since he'd moved back to Portland. I kept picking up my phone to call him, then putting it down again, paralyzed by the magnitude of what his confession meant and what my response might cost us both. It was Michelle Parker, a mutual friend from college, who finally forced the issue. She was in town for a work conference and had planned to meet both Henry and me for drinks. But when she called to confirm, I had to admit that Henry and I weren't exactly speaking at the moment. "What did you do?" she asked, because Michelle had always been direct in ways that were both refreshing and terrifying. "Why do you assume I did something?" "Because Henry Walker is the most patient, understanding person on the planet. And if he's not talking to you, it's because you broke his heart." The words hit me like a physical blow, partly because they were true and partly because I hadn't thought about it from Henry's perspective. I'd been so focused on my own fear and confusion that I hadn't considered what my silence might be doing to him. He'd taken the biggest risk of his life by telling me how he felt, and I'd responded by disappearing. "It's complicated," I said, which was both true and completely inadequate. "It's only complicated because you're making it complicated," Michelle replied. "That man has been in love with you since sophomore year. Everyone could see it except you, and maybe you could see it too, but we're too scared to do anything about it. But he finally got brave enough to say it out loud, and now you're hiding because you might actually have to be happy for once in your life." After she hung up, I sat in my apartment, staring at the wall and thinking about what she'd said. Was I really so afraid of happiness that I'd sabotage it before it could begin? Had I become so comfortable with longing that I didn't know how to handle the possibility of fulfillment? That night, I dreamed about Henry for the first time in years. In the dream, we were back in college, sitting on those library steps, sharing wine and talking about the future. But this time, when the moment came to speak or stay silent, I chose differently. I reached across the space between us and touched his face, and he leaned into my hand like he'd been waiting his whole life for that simple contact. I woke up with tears on my face and the absolute certainty that I'd been an idiot. I called him Henry that morning, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried again at lunch, then again after work, but he wasn't answering. I drove by his apartment that evening and saw his car in the parking lot, so I knew he was home. But when I knocked on his door, there was no answer. He was avoiding me the way I'd been avoiding him, and I couldn't blame him for that. It took 3 days of persistent calling and texting before he finally agreed to meet me for coffee. He suggested a place downtown that we'd never been to together, neutral territory that wouldn't carry the weight of our shared history. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting at a corner table with his hands wrapped around a mug like he needed the warmth. He looked tired, older somehow than he had just 2 weeks earlier. His hair was messier than usual, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he had been sleeping about as well as I had. When he looked up and saw me approaching, his expression was carefully neutral, guarded in a way that made my chest ache. "Hi," I said, sitting down across from him. "Hi." We stared at each other for a moment, and I realized I had no idea how to begin this conversation. How do you apologize for breaking someone's heart with your silence? How do you explain that you've been in love with them too, but were too afraid to admit it, even to yourself? "I'm sorry," I said finally. "I'm sorry for disappearing, for not calling, for making you think that what you said didn't matter to me." Henry nodded but didn't speak, waiting for me to continue. "The truth is it mattered too much," I said. "What you said, I mean. It mattered so much that I didn't know how to respond without completely falling apart. And now you do?" I took a deep breath and looked directly into his eyes, trying to find the courage that had abandoned me in the park 2 weeks earlier. "Now I know that I've been in love with you since college. Maybe since that first day in Professor Martinez's class when you asked to borrow a pen. I know that every relationship I've tried to have with other people has failed because they weren't you. I know that I've been so afraid of losing your friendship that I almost lost you anyway by being too much of a coward to tell you how I feel." Something shifted in Henry's expression, the careful guard dropping just enough to let me see the hope underneath. "I know that I want to try," I continued. "I want to be brave enough to see what we could be together, even if it scares me more than anything I've ever done in my life." Henry was quiet for a long moment, studying my face like he was trying to determine whether I meant what I was saying. Finally, he reached across the table and covered my hand with his. The first time we'd touched since that night in his kitchen when our fingers had collided over the dishes. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Because I can't go back to pretending after this. If we try and it doesn't work, I don't think I can just be your friend again." The honesty in his voice, the vulnerability he was showing me even after I'd hurt him, made me understand how much courage it had taken for him to tell me how he felt in the first place. And it made me want to be equally brave. "I'm sure," I said, and meant it more than I'd ever meant anything in my life. We left the coffee shop together and walked slowly back toward his apartment, not talking much, but not needing to. There was something different in the air between us now, a sense of possibility that felt both thrilling and terrifying. When we reached his building, Henry paused at the entrance. "Do you want to come up?" he asked, and I could hear the question underneath the question. "Yes," I said, because it was time to stop being afraid of what I wanted. His apartment looked the same as always, but everything felt different now that we'd finally said the words out loud. Henry moved around the space with a nervous energy I'd never seen in him before, straightening things that didn't need to be straightened, offering me drinks I didn't want. I realized he was as scared as I was, maybe more so, because he'd been carrying these feelings longer and had more to lose. "Henry," I said, and he stopped fussing with the books on his coffee table to look at me. "Yeah? Come here." He crossed the room slowly, stopping just in front of where I was sitting on his couch. I reached up and took his hands, pulling him down to sit beside me, close enough that our knees touched. "I don't know how to do this," I admitted. "I've never been with a man before, never even really admitted to myself that I wanted to be. But I know I want to learn, and I know I want to learn with you." Henry lifted one hand to touch my face, his thumb brushing across my cheekbone in a gesture so tender it made my breath catch. "We don't have to figure everything out tonight," he said. "We have time." And then he kissed me, soft and careful and perfect. And I understood finally what all those love songs were about. It was nothing like kissing the women I'd dated, nothing like what I'd expected. It was better, deeper, like coming home to a place I'd never known I was looking for. When we broke apart, Henry rested his forehead against mine, both of us breathing hard. "I've wanted to do that for so long," he whispered. "Why didn't you?" "Because I was afraid you'd run away. I thought about all the times I probably would have run, all the years we'd wasted because we were both too scared to take the risk." "I'm not running now," I said. "No," he agreed, smiling for the first time since I'd walked into the coffee shop. "You're not." We spent that evening talking, really talking, about everything we'd been too afraid to say before. Henry told me about the years in Seattle, how he'd tried to date other people but could never stop comparing them to me. I told him about Christopher and all the others, How I'd always felt like I was going through the motions of relationships without ever really connecting with anyone. I think I always knew, I said as we lay on his couch together, my head on his shoulder, his fingers running through my hair. About myself, about you. I just wasn't ready to know it. And now you are? I lifted my head to look at him, this man who had been my best friend for years and was now something more. Something I didn't have words for yet, but could feel in every cell of my body. Now I am, I said, and kissed him again, to prove it. The next few weeks passed in a haze of discovery and adjustment. We took things slowly, both of us aware that we were navigating uncharted territory and trying not to rush towards something we weren't ready for. But even taking it slow, everything felt different now. The casual touches that had once been charged with unspoken tension were now simple expressions of affection. The long conversations that had once danced around the truth could now be direct and honest. Henry was patient with my uncertainty, never pushing when I needed space to process what was happening between us. There were moments when the reality of being in a relationship with a man felt overwhelming, when years of assumptions about my own identity came crashing down around me. But Henry was there through all of it, steady and understanding and completely committed to helping me figure it out at my own pace. Our first real fight came about a month after we'd gotten together, and it was about something completely stupid. I'd made plans to have dinner with some coworkers, and Henry had assumed he was invited. When I explained that it was just a work thing, he got quiet in a way that I'd learned meant he was hurt, but trying not to show it. "Are you ashamed of me?" he asked finally, and the question hit me like a punch to the stomach. "What? No, of course not." "Then why haven't you told anyone about us? Why do I feel like I'm still your secret?" The truth was that I hadn't told anyone because I wasn't sure how to explain what we were to each other. How do you tell people that you've discovered you're in love with your best friend, that everything you thought you knew about yourself has turned out to be incomplete? How do you come out to coworkers and family members when you're still figuring out what that means for yourself? But looking at Henry's face, seeing the hurt he was trying so hard to hide, I realized that my uncertainty was causing him pain. He'd taken the risk of being open about his feelings, and I was still hiding behind my own fear and confusion. "You're right," I said. "I'm sorry. I'm not ashamed of you. I'm just scared of having to explain something I don't completely understand myself yet." "What don't you understand?" "How to be in love with you without losing myself in the process. How to be gay or bisexual or whatever I am without feeling like I'm betraying everyone I used to be. How to tell my parents that their son is dating his best friend and it's the best thing that's ever happened to him." Henry's expression softened and he reached for my hand. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," he said, "but you do have to trust me enough to let me be part of your life, not just the secret part that nobody else gets to see." He was right, and I knew it. The next week, I told my coworkers about Henry, introducing him as my boyfriend with a pride that surprised me. I called my parents and had the most difficult conversation of my life, explaining that I was in love with someone they'd known for years, but in a way they'd never expected. My mother cried, not from disappointment, but from relief that I was finally happy, that I'd found someone who loved me as much as she could see Henry did. Coming out wasn't a single moment, but a series of small revelations, each one making me feel more like myself than I'd ever felt before. And through it all, Henry was there, supporting me when I needed it and giving me space when I needed that too. By summer, we'd settled into a rhythm that felt natural and right. We kept our own apartments but spent most nights together, cooking dinner and watching movies and talking about everything and nothing. Henry was working on a novel in his spare time, and sometimes I'd wake up to find him scribbling in that same small notebook he'd used in college, his brow furrowed in the same concentrated expression that had first caught my attention all those years ago. "What are you writing about?" And I asked one morning, finally brave enough to ask the question I'd been wondering about for years. He looked up from his notebook and smiled, a little embarrassed. "Us, actually. The story of how we found each other." "Can I read it?" "When it's finished," he said. "I want to get the ending right first." That brings me back to the night that changed everything. The night 3 months ago when Henry showed up at my door, drunk and desperate, and finally ready to say the words we'd both been carrying for years. Except that's not exactly what happened. The truth is more complicated than that. more painful and more beautiful than the story I've been telling myself. The truth is that Henry didn't come to my door to confess his love. He came to say goodbye. It was a Tuesday in late September, and I'd spent the evening at home grading papers from the community college class I'd started teaching part-time. Henry and I had been together for 4 months by then, and things had been good between us, better than good. We'd found our rhythm as a couple, learned how to navigate the transition from friends to lovers without losing the foundation that had brought us together in the first place. But Henry had been quiet lately, distracted in a way that reminded me of those weeks before he'd first told me how he felt. When I asked him about it, he'd brush off my concerns, claiming he was just stressed about work or tired from not sleeping well. I'd believed him because I wanted to, because the alternative was too frightening to consider. The knock on my door came at 2:17 in the morning. I know the exact time because I looked at my clock when I heard it, wondering who would be visiting at such an hour. When I opened the door, Henry was standing there exactly as I described, soaked from the rain and swaying slightly, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. But his eyes didn't hold love or longing or any of the tender emotions I'd imagined. They held desperation and fear and something that looked dangerously close to goodbye. "I got the job," he said without preamble, and my heart stopped. I knew immediately what job he was talking about. 3 weeks earlier, he'd mentioned almost casually that he'd applied for a position at a literary magazine in New York, one of the most prestigious publications in the country. It was his dream job, the kind of opportunity that came along once in a lifetime. I'd encouraged him to apply, told him he'd be perfect for it, tried to be supportive, even as a part of me hoped he wouldn't get it. "That's wonderful," I said, and meant it even as my world began to crumble around me. "Congratulations." "They want me to start in 2 weeks," he continued, still standing in my doorway, still dripping rainwater onto my floor. "I have to give my answer tomorrow." "And you're going to say yes?" It wasn't a question. I could see the answer in his face, in the way he couldn't quite meet my eyes, in the set of his shoulders that suggested he'd already made up his mind. "I don't know," he said, but we both knew he was lying. "That's why I'm here. I need to know what you think I should do." What I should have said was that he should take the job, that it was an incredible opportunity, and I'd be selfish to ask him to turn it down for me. What I should have said was that we could make a long-distance relationship work, that love could survive geography and time zones and the thousand small separations that come with building careers in different cities. But I was 26 years old and scared and still learning how to be in love with someone without losing myself in the process. So instead of saying any of those things, I asked the question that had been haunting me since the day we'd first kissed. "Is this what you want?" I said. "Really? Because sometimes I feel like you're settling for me, like you're trying to make something out of work that isn't supposed to work just because we've been friends for so long." The words came out wrong, harsher than I'd intended, but they'd been building inside me for months. All my insecurities about being new to relationships with men, about not being experienced enough or confident enough or sure enough of my own identity to be what Henry needed. Henry stared at me for a long moment, and I watched something break in his expression. "Settling?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "You think I'm settling for you?" "I don't know what to think," I said, and that was the truth. This is all so new for me, and sometimes I wonder if we're just trying to force something that worked as friendship into something it was never meant to be. Henry stepped back like I'd slapped him, and I realized I'd said exactly the wrong thing at exactly the wrong moment. He'd come to me looking for reassurance, for some sign that what we had was worth staying for, and I'd responded by questioning whether we should be together at all. "I see," he said, his voice going flat and distant in the way it had that day in the park when I had asked for time to think. "Well, I guess that makes my decision easier." "Henry, wait." But he was already walking away, back down the hallway toward the stairs, leaving me standing in my doorway, watching him disappear for the second time in our relationship. I wanted to call after him, to run down the hall and explain that I hadn't meant what I'd said, that I was just scared and confused and desperately in love with him. But my feet felt rooted to the floor, and by the time I found my voice, he was already gone. I didn't sleep for the rest of that night, or for many nights after. I kept replaying the conversation, thinking of all the things I should have said instead, all the ways I could have handled it differently. I should have told him I loved him, that he wasn't settling for me any more than I was settling for him. I should have told him to take the job and that we'd figure out how to make it work. I should have been brave enough to fight for what we had instead of letting my own insecurities sabotage the best thing that had ever happened to me. Henry left for New York 10 days later without saying goodbye. I found out from Michelle, who called to ask if I was planning to throw him a going-away party. When I explained that I hadn't even known he was leaving, the silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. "What did you do this time?" she asked. And I told her everything. The whole pathetic story of how I'd managed to destroy the most important relationship of my life through fear and stupidity and terrible timing. "You have to go after him," she said when I finished. "You have to get on a plane and tell him you were wrong, and that you love him and that you want to try to make it work." But I didn't go after him. I told myself it was because he'd made his choice, that he'd picked his career over our relationship, and I had to respect that. But the truth was simpler and more cowardly. I was afraid he wouldn't want me back, afraid that I'd burn that bridge beyond repair when I'd question whether we belonged together. The months that followed were some of the darkest of my life. I threw myself into work, picked up extra classes at the community college, started volunteering at a literacy program downtown. Anything to keep my mind off the Henry-shaped hole in my life. My friends tried to be supportive, inviting me out for drinks and dinners, and generally trying to help me move on. But how do you move on from someone who was your best friend for years before he became the love of your life? I started therapy, something I probably should have done years earlier. Dr. Sarah Jimenez, ironically sharing a name with Henry's college girlfriend, helped me work through the complicated feelings I had about my sexuality, my fear of commitment, and my tendency to sabotage good things before they could hurt me. It was slow work, painful work, but gradually I began to understand myself better, to see the patterns of behavior that had led me to push Henry away just when I should have been pulling him closer. "You were protecting yourself," Dr. Jimenez said during one of our sessions. But sometimes protecting ourselves from pain also protects us from joy. 3 months passed without any contact between Henry and me. I followed him on social media from a distance, watching as he posted pictures of his new life in New York, his new job, the friends he was making. He looked happy, or at least he looked like he was trying to be happy, and I told myself that was what mattered. He was building the life he had always wanted, and the fact that it didn't include me was just something I'd have to learn to live with. But then, on a rainy night in December that reminded me painfully of the night he had come to say goodbye, my phone rang. Henry's name appeared on the screen, and I stared at it for several rings before finding the courage to answer. "Hi," I said, my voice barely steady. "Hi," he replied, and just hearing him say that one word made my chest ache with longing. "How are you?" "I'm—" He paused, and I could hear him taking a deep breath. "I'm miserable, Scott. I'm living my dream life in the greatest city in the world, and I'm absolutely miserable." I closed my eyes and leaned against my kitchen counter, not trusting myself to speak. "The job is everything I thought it would be," he continued. "The work is challenging and meaningful, and I'm learning so much. But none of it matters because you're not here to share it with. I can't enjoy anything because the person I most want to tell about it is 3,000 miles away, and I don't even know if he wants to hear from me." "Henry," I said, his name coming out like a prayer. "I know I don't have any right to call you," he said. "I know I'm the one who left, who chose this job over what we had. But I need you to know that it wasn't because I was settling for you or because I didn't think we could work. It was because I was scared that you were right, that maybe we were trying to force something that wasn't meant to be. And I thought if I left before we could fail, I could at least preserve the memory of what we'd had. But that's not what happened, is it?" "No," he said, and I could hear the tears in his voice. "What happened is that I realized I'd rather fail at loving you than succeed at anything else." We talked for 3 hours that night, both of us crying and apologizing and trying to figure out how we'd gotten so lost along the way. Henry told me about New York, about the loneliness of being in a city full of people who didn't know him, about waking up every morning and reaching for me before remembering I wasn't there. I told him about therapy, about the work I'd been doing to understand myself better, about how empty my life had felt without him in it. I want to come home, he said finally. I want to quit this job and move back to Portland and spend the rest of my life making up for the mistake I made when I left. You can't do that, I said, even though every cell in my body was screaming at me to let him. This job is your dream. You can't give up your dream for me. You're my dream, he said simply. Everything else is just details. But I'd learned something about love during those 3 months apart, something that therapy and loneliness and missing him desperately had taught me. Love isn't about possession or sacrifice or giving up your dreams for another person. Love is about supporting each other's dreams, about finding ways to build a life together that honors both people's needs and aspirations. What if I came to you instead, I said, the words surprising me as much as they seemed to surprise him. What do you mean? I mean, what if I moved to New York? I could teach there, freelance, figure something out. What if, instead of you giving up your dream job, we found a way to make this work? The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I began to worry he'd hung up. Scott, he said finally, are you serious? I've never been more serious about anything in my life, I said, and realized it was true. I love you, Henry. I've loved you for years, and I was an idiot for not fighting for us when I had the chance. But I'm fighting now. If you'll have me, if you think we can make it work, I want to try on. Are you sure? Because New York is expensive and crowded and nothing like Portland, and I don't want you to move here just to discover you hate it. I'm sure, I said. Besides, I've been thinking about making a change anyway. Maybe it's time for me to take some risks, to stop playing it safe all the time. 3 weeks later, I was on a plane to New York with 2 suitcases and a heart full of hope and terror in equal measure. Henry met me at the airport, and when I saw him waiting for me at the gate, I understood that everything I'd been afraid of losing by taking this risk was nothing compared to what I stood to gain. He looked different than he had in Portland, more sophisticated maybe, his hair a little shorter and his clothes a little sharper. But when he smiled at me, it was the same smile that had been making my heart race since college. And when he kissed me right there in the middle of JFK Airport, I knew I'd made the right choice. Welcome home, he said against my lips, and I realized that home wasn't a place at all. Home was wherever Henry was, wherever we were together, building something real and lasting and worth every risk we'd taken to get there. It's been 2 years since I moved to New York, and we're still figuring it out, still learning how to love each other without losing ourselves in the process. I teach at a community college in Brooklyn and freelance for several publications, work that challenges me in ways my old job never did. Henry is thriving at the magazine, and last month his novel was accepted for publication by a small but respected press. We fight sometimes about money and space and whose turn it is to do the dishes. We struggle with the challenges that all couples face, the daily work of building a life together. But we also laugh together every day, support each other's dreams, and fall asleep in each other's arms every night, grateful for the second chance we almost didn't take. Last week, Henry proposed to me in Central Park, on a bench not far from where we'd had our first real date as New Yorkers. It was nothing like the dramatic gesture you might expect, just a quiet moment on a Sunday afternoon when he turned to me and said, I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me? I said yes, of course, because after all these years of being afraid to want what I wanted, I finally learned that the biggest risk isn't loving someone too much. The biggest risk is not loving them enough to try. So here I am, sitting in our apartment, looking at the rain against our window and thinking about that night 3 months ago, when everything changed. Except it wasn't 3 months ago, and it wasn't the night I described at the beginning of this story. It was 2 years ago, and it was the night that taught me that sometimes the end of something is really just the beginning of something better. The rain is still falling, but it doesn't sound like fingers drumming anymore. It sounds like applause, like the city celebrating the fact that two people who were too scared to love each other finally found the courage to try it. And maybe that's the real story after all. Not the dramatic confession or the grand gesture, but the quiet daily choice to keep choosing each other, to keep building something beautiful out of all our fears and hopes and dreams. Henry is in the kitchen making dinner, humming something under his breath, and in a few minutes I'll get up from this couch and go help him. And we'll eat together and talk about our days and plan our wedding and our future. It's ordinary and extraordinary at the same time, this life we've built together, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. Outside, the rain keeps falling, and I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be.